Since the release of For Honor, there has been an ongoing debate online between who would win, knights, Vikings, or samurai. One thing I noticed in these discussions is that most of us don't have a great deal of historical knowledge of many of these cultures outside of what we see in pop culture or little nuggets of information we've picked up over the years. For that reason, ever since Season 1 of For Honor, I've taken it upon myself to track down historians and professionals in each field to discuss tactics, weaponry, and ask them the age-old question, who would win? We've already spoken to Dr. Roderick Dale about the Vikings, Dr. Jonathan Clements about the samurai. You can find links to these videos in the video description, and today we're talking to Kelly de Vries about the knights. Kelly is a respected historian who specialises in the warfare of the Middle Ages and has written a number of books on the topic which I'd highly recommend you check out. Before we get into the video, I just want to say a couple of things. Obviously, this video is around 50 minutes long. Basically see it as a podcast of sorts. What you'll see on screen is simply gameplay footage of For Honor's campaign. It's simply there as a companion to the real soul of this video, which is the interview itself. So feel free to minimize the video and just listen to the audio. I will equally include timestamps for each section of the interview just in case you want to skip ahead. If you do enjoy today's video, which is part of my Game Anatomy series where I dissect the lore of our favourite games, do feel free to subscribe to be notified of new episodes. Or if you want to support the content I produce here on the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon in the video description. All that said, do let me know your thoughts on today's video down in the comments, but sit back, relax, and enjoy. Kelly, for the people who will be watching this, tell us who you are and what you've done and how you've acquired the knowledge of this period of history that you have.
Well, it's good you asked. I'm because just I figured out just this month I have had my PhD for 30 years.
Wow.
So I was a grad student at University of Toronto in the Center for Medieval Studies. Received a PhD in medieval studies 30 years ago, and have been professor at Loyola University for the last 26 years. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. I've written quite a few things on medieval military history and medieval history of military technology. Mm-hmm. And I'm a honorary historical consultant for the Royal Armouries in the UK.
Wow. So, I mean, it would be safe to say, Kelly, that you be looked at as being somewhat of a informed voice on a topic like this.
Yeah, I'm sure there is some. Just I have no information whatsoever. But yes, I could absolutely give you some of my opinions, and they're
of course
based on a lot of study of medieval military history, and especially the knightly class that carried out most of the conflicts, at least led most of the conflicts.
How would medieval European culture have coped or dealt with a natural disaster of the scale that we see in the narrative of For Honor, where food, water, other resources are in short supply?
Well, you know, to a certain extent, while it was not a similar natural disaster, it is the knightly classes, the classes of medieval Europe that do go through the greatest pandemic natural pandemic that we had, the Black Death. So while there was struggles for water and food and so forth, that may not have been the most important thing. Of course, the most important thing in Black Death was the disease. They did cope with it, and they had to cope with it. And so coping with natural disasters is not difficult. Now, if we were to take that hypothetically and just turn it a bit, recognize, of course, that when you have knights who are essentially in charge of society, a noble class in charge of society, elite warriors in charge of society, they are only eating and other things based on the peasants that they control, who plow the fields and plant the fields, and the ones that bring them the food and so forth, so that they can their lifestyle and be obligated to go to war when it's necessary. So it was not just important for them to survive; it was important for the entirety to survive. And consequently, when you do have something like the famine in 1315 to 17, which is the most major famine in the Middle Ages,
Hmm.
the medieval knights respond by allowing the peasants more food for
Wow.
themselves. The problem was is the towns that suffered then because
Hmm.
they were they were the kind of middle classes and were caught and were caught without the appropriate foods and so
Hmm.
lost a larger percentage of population than were lost in the fields.
Mm. So it's a kind of situation where it seems, based on the Black Death, that whenever the knight class are faced with kind of catastrophic events, they quite logically understand that if the peasantry don't survive, then they don't get to live such a nice lifestyle. So they are self-sacrificial to look after the peasants in a way to kind of look after themselves going forward. Would that be right?
That's right. And we get I mean, we see society. It used to be called feudal society, or whether you want to call it a obligatory society. We always see that as being, very much like a slave owning culture and so forth. And
Mm.
I'm not going to say it's better than what we have at other times in history, but there was this recognition that they couldn't plow. They could
Yeah.
not, I mean, if the peasants aren't taken care of, then the noble class doesn't exist. And
Mm.
it only takes one to really replace a knight,
Hmm.
in order, for a family to survive in an elite, in the nobles, among the nobles. But it takes,
Hmm.
peasants need to be out there in fairly great numbers. And after the Black Death, we see this incredible willingness of the noble classes to up the wages of peasants, to allow wages of peasants, to allow them to keep
Mm.
more food, to give them more land of their own, because they're in shorter supply, and the supply and demand was recognized at that time.
Mm.
The only ones who are really rough on the peasants in the Middle Ages is the church. They're,
Yes.
if you're a peasant on a monastic domain, then you're not nearly treated as well as those who are on a noble's domain.
So I mean, secondly, kind of getting into the knight class more specifically, if a medieval, now the tricky thing here is that I believe in For Honor we're looking at knights that are around, I think maybe the 11th, between the 11th to the 13th century, which is
Mhm.
quite there's quite a broad spectrum there. So I mean, if we were to lean upon one or the other, if a knight was standing in front of us ready to do battle, what weaponry and armor would we typically see them in?
Well, so if you're thinking about that period, you're looking specifically at a period that is defined as far as military technology is concerned, really as far as uh, tactics and other things are concerned, but by the Crusades. So
Mm.
the European knights, we do call Crusaders knights, even though they may not have gone through the formal ceremonies that come along a little bit later, probably not until the 12th century.
Mm-hmm.
The Crusader knights are unite Europe in not in countries, not in principalities at all, but in such things as arms and armor and such things as fortifications, because they see each other's and they are picking up certain traits from having to use them more often, having to use them against an enemy that is equally well armored and perhaps a little bit better accustomed to the region that they're in.
Mm.
Now, it does vary. So if we look at a knight in the 11th century, at the beginning of the Crusades, we're looking at essentially the Bayeux Tapestry type knight.
Mm-hmm.
So um, they are outfitted in mail, which is what it's called, not chainmail. It's mail, um, and they have a mail torso armor, which was very similar, and descended from the Carolingian byrnie covered the upper arms, not too far up the upper arms, but upper arms, the torso, a bit of the neck, and the waist and groin area. Mm-hmm. There is evidence in the Bayeux Tapestry, and there was evidence in the First Crusade that the more noble individuals, the ones who were wealthier, would also wear coifs of mail, which is the mail that comes over the head, not necessarily attached to, but it's often attached to the torso armor, mm-hmm. and then armor that descended down the leg to protect the leg and the foot. We're still a little bit of ways, but not too far before it will cover the arms and hands as well. Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that medieval military historians have is that if they're moving to a to a warmer spot, to a hotter spot like the Middle East, mm-hmm. why is it that they're actually gaining more armor? Because that all adds weight. It all adds. You got to remember, this is also metal, but it can be worn straight on the skin. So they're wearing padded garments underneath, or leather, on top of their regular clothing. So that many layers and metal on top of it is going to become quite hot. And then probably a jupon or a covering that has the cross on it somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the helmet. Well, I'll get to the helmets in a moment because they'll change the most.
Yeah.
But that's what they would have worn. And why did they go into a hotter area with all this, more armor than you can see in the Bayeux Tapestry? And the plausible answer has been that there were more archers that they faced, horse archers especially, and that this meant not so many directed shots that might have been to the torso or to the head, but shots that range and then are going to hit the members, the legs and the arms. And that may be the reason. There may also just been more constant warfare, and it may also have just been taste or fashion, shall we say.
Yeah.
The helmets and the shields will change the most during the Crusade. So basically, throughout the 12th and 13th century until the very early 14th century, that is pretty standard armor. Mm-hmm. The mail that covers the body. The things that change is the helmet. So the helmet will start out to be the helmet that is in the Bayeux Tapestry, what we call a nasal helm. That is a conical helmet with the bar that comes down over the nose. Mm-hmm. Not as fancy as some of the ones in Hollywood, but enough that a slash across the face would have been impeded by it.
Yeah.
At pretty much anything above the mouth. And this helmet would be sat upon the coif and so forth. Now, that changes by the Second Crusade, by the middle of the 12th century. The helmets begin to have more of a facial covering. And they may have a visor, they may have a little bit lower brow on them. And again, whether this is because of the constant warfare, whether it's because of the arrows, we don't know. But by 1200, the great helmet come in to play, which is the one we see that's the bucket, essentially the bucket on top of the head. Now, that very much diminishes the eyesight and the breath. And but the helmets that we see that are associated around that period, especially in the 13th century, are going to be great helms. And by the end of the 13th century, we start seeing things like kettle helms. Well, 1250, to use the example of the Morgan Picture Bible, which used to be called the Masiowski Psalter, and is perhaps the most beautiful military illustrations that come out of the Middle Ages. And we do see kettle hats, we see steel visors, and we see these great helms all mixed together, and that's probably how it was. Mm-hmm. The shield will start with the big kite shield that the Bayeux Tapestry has, and it was worn probably, well, we see them in illustrations that date to the Second Crusade, the middle of the 12th century, even as late as some around 1180 or so forth. But it also it transforms to a more triangular shield that isn't necessary to protect the lower leg as the kite shaped shield was. And again, that's the one where you can almost trace everybody else to archers or to more concept fighting into fashion. The shield shape changing that way has never been explained sufficiently for me, but that's what what does happen.
I mean, the fact that kind of changing from that early helmet to the later kind of the bucket helms, I think is what you called them.
Yeah, they're just called the Great Helms.
Yeah, so the fact that the Great Helms are lessening your vision and I guess giving you less access to, especially if you're wearing so much armor, and for instance, if you are fighting in such a warm country, if it's restricting your airflow, I mean, is there a greater reason to wearing something like that, or is it simply down to fashion and greater safety?
It's down to greater safety. I don't think you can say fashion. It's an ugly helmet.
Yeah.
You know, these things, they do look like buckets that are just stuck on their heads.
Yeah.
And the ones that we have extant, most of the ones we have extant are a little bit in the 14th century, but they still are not, you know, they're not very functional. They're just, I mean, not very functional in an offensive way, but they are very functional in a defensive way. They protect. The protection was extraordinary. Just recently, I co-authored an article on wounds in the Middle Ages with the Bob Usum Savage at the Royal Armories, who was in charge of Richard III's wounds when they dug the body up. And I went through all the archaeological reports that I could find, all the way back to late Roman period and carrying them all the way through to 1499. And the number of wounds that were either fatal or there were, in fact, some that were not fatal, but the number of wounds to the head were the most.
Wow.
And you can understand that. I mean, now, one thing we don't have, because the torso is mostly tissue, but, you know, there's marks on the ribs and so forth, but the head is the most fatal one. It's going to have the injuries to the brain, to the face, to the skull that are not, you know, people are not going to be able to come back from, to the jaw, and those are all there in all of these heavily violent excavation of heavily violent killed individuals, and you know, so something like the Great Helm, there's going to be a time when you're weighing the protectability and the comfort. And, you know, if you're in warfare more constantly, and you're in a warfare like the Crusades that are not a forgiving one, meaning that your ability to pay your ransom does not determine whether you're taken as a prisoner or not.
Yeah.
That is going to mean you want to protect yourself. And if that means you are diminishing your eyesight, then you do. It probably meant that there was more warfare that was, you know, night on night charges in some sort of tournament fashion, where the head does not need to be rotated to see an opponent to the side, and less hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
But we see it even as late as 1403, when Henry V, or the future Henry V, at the Battle of Shrewsbury, has to either raise his visor. By that time, the Great Helms become close helms, which were around the head with visors, same protection, but he has to raise his to either get some more breath or to communicate with his men easier. And he gets an arrow that goes right through and nearly kills him.
Grief.
So, and that's one of the reasons why Henry V always has his portrait done only as a side view rather than a full-on view, because he has a big scar. So,
wow.
But he lived, you know, that was 1403. I mean, he doesn't die till 1422. So, and lots of campaigns in the Battle of Agincourt ahead of him. So it you know, it was costly to make that kind of an error. He had to take the risk, because he had to move his troops just at the time he gets shot. But that's sort of the nature of arms and armor at during the entire Middle Ages. Is is it going to be comfortable? Are you looking for comfort, or are you looking for protection?
Yeah.
And almost always it falls the protection.
I mean, one thing that we see kind of coming up in that answer a bit is archery, or the ability to protect oneself against arrow fire. I mean, looking there may perhaps have been information on this through the journals that you were looking through, but and kind of tying into the next question, how effective would a knight's armor have been against, say, arrows? We'll start with arrows first, but and equally, was death from arrow fire quite a common thing on the battlefield?
Well, yes and no, and that's pretty much the answer, but only because the arrow fire or arrow shot. I mean, you don't fire arrows, so but that across the, I think I'm the loyal opposition to the English. To this English nationalistic feeling about the longbow archers being able to pluck the French right out of horses, right off of horses, and therefore they win all the battles. First of all, they don't win the war, which is very much a more important question. But second of all, when you read the sources, you realize that the longbow archery did exactly what the kings of England wanted to do. So if Edward I is using it against the Scots, if Edward III is using it against the French at Crécy, Henry V is using it at Agincourt, they don't exaggerate the archery. Mm-hmm. So they don't have the archers shoot into knights who are fully armored, who are moving. Mm-hmm. They have them shoot the horses. And in Crécy, we are told over and over and over again that it is the horses that as the French knights come over the rise and run through their troops. They're generally crossbowmen who are trying to leave the field. They're not purposefully running over them. They're not that stupid, but they are running over them, and that's disrupting the charge. And then they get hit by the arrows. The number of horses that are brought down and the way the horses react in the contemporary chronicles give us an indication that the knights themselves are probably not as hurt. Yes, an arrow could find an opening, but it wasn't as much as this popular notion of Bernard Cornwell novels and so forth would have us believe that an archer would burst the rings on mail armor. We got to remember, mail armor is worn for 1,000 years. Yeah. So it's not bad. And suddenly it doesn't reach the longbow archery, and everybody say, "Oh, we can't go to fight against the English." Yeah. Because they've got this super weapon. They've got this super weapon. They continue to fight, and of course, the English have victories on the battlefield, but they don't have victories in the wars. So the longbow archery may not be as strong. I gave a paper once in England called "The Failure of the English Longbow." Oh dear! And you would have thought that I had that I had crossed the line into spitting on the Queen or something. And you're lucky they didn't imprison you for high treason. Well, exactly. I mean, I did get Robert Hardy, the actor who was so influential in determining longbow strength, and determining it wrongly in my estimation, from the Mary Rose bows. He once told me in a conference, he says that I knew nothing about the English longbow, and I told But the funny thing is that we agreed that we both had respect for the archer, and see, that's where I think that if you start having too much technological determinism with the arrows, then you lose the notion that the men who fought and the men who led the men who fought are the ones who won battles. Yeah, it wasn't what they carried. It wasn't what they used, that all helped. But if they weren't good soldiers, and if they weren't well-led soldiers, they didn't win. And we forget that. Well, Hardy and I did tend to agree on that. One time when I was at the Royal Armouries, I had them do an experiment, because they were the ones who kind of let me on to they were, if you go to curators of armor, they tend to be rather proud of their armor. And what they're curating has been around for a very long time, so they have a right to be proud about it. But we put on a moving target a mail armor with the underclothing it would have had as well. And we moved the target. And the strange thing is that the mail, because of the way it's situated, does not stay solid. It moves as well, and you get the overlapping of rings in many instances. And the only thing that penetrated that was the pull of a crossbow, 400 pounds.
Wow. And
steel crossbow, so 15th century weapon, was the only thing that penetrated that. And that was not just arrows. The longbow arrows, the sharp, pointy, all the different arrows, when they hit the mail, they would curl up like little pigtails with the force. And but they also used other weapons, a sword, and a mace and other things, and it did not break the armor. I mean, I'm sure that there were great big bruises underneath it.
Yeah.
But that did not break the armor. And that seems to be the indication too, that there are very few, from the graves, there are very few torso wounds, unless they're direct. I mean, Richard the King John, the Blind of Bohemia, who died at Crecy, has had his body excavated, and there was a puncture right through his armor, but he was laying flat on the ground, and somebody stood over him and literally pushed it in.
Yeah.
And although the irony is, coup de grace might have been a dagger to his eye, considering he was blind. That's he may have been the only one who couldn't have seen something like that happening. But that was the point. I got asked on a American show called Deadliest Warriors, and they would pit things like the knight versus the pirate, and the Viking versus the ninja, which is crazy things anyway.
Yeah.
They repeated my experiment and used these big, huge guys, bodybuilding guys, to try to break through the mail, and they couldn't. And they, no matter how they hit at it, they could not break through the mail because it was moving, and the rings were very, very strong. They were very strong in their shape, but also very strong in the construction, which is why it was around 1,000 years. So when the TV people said to me, "Well, how would they have gotten? How would they have killed on the battlefield? Do you mean that they would have beheaded?" And I said, "No." I said, "Think about a beheading. I mean, first of all, it'd have to go through whatever mail armor is coming down from the top of the head, the quad, for mail armor is going up. It would have to then go through whatever is underneath it to protect the neck from the mail, like so leather or padded felt, and then all the way through the head or through the neck, and repeat itself coming out the other side." So they said, "Well, what did they use?" And I said, "Well," every knight carried a dagger. And you can see them on all the effigies. You can see them on all the illustrations. They carried a nice, sharp dagger. Some with very ribald hilts. But these thin daggers, if they got a knight debilitated a knight, brought him down off his horse, put him on the crown, whatever, is they could reach underneath part the armors on the neck and go for the carotid artery, or go underneath the arm where the armor was thinnest there, into the armpit, and go for the heart, go up through the groin to the femoral artery, where again the armor was not as thick as well. And that's how they killed somebody on the battlefield. And of course, the TV producer said, "Well, we can't put that on TV." So evidently, a beheading was fine, but
Yeah, a little stabbing isn't.
A real stab would not have been. But if
Yeah.
if a knight, if that was the notion. So, for example, at Crécy, where Edward III forbids capture of French prisoners, and until the very end, that's how they were dispatched. When the same thing with the Black Prince at Poitiers, and we're told that the archers did it. Well, the archers didn't pull out their arrow and stand 5 feet away from the guy, shoot it at him. They pulled out their dagger and did him in. So there were different means of death that didn't require the more fantastical notions of modern interpreters to make the knights more vulnerable but more stupid.
I mean, this is something that we saw coming up as well. Whenever we were talking about the Vikings. The Vikings were kind of a very different beast compared to these other two cultures. But whenever we were chatting about the samurai, when we covered that as well, it was a very similar situation where the samurai would have carried a small dagger, because the armor was so strong against the weaponry that they were using. They would have gotten close, got out a dagger, and then just stabbed in the neck, or the weak points of the armor. I think this is something that is, I guess, overlooked quite a bit, quite rightly, not only in film and TV, but also I think online whenever most people are talking about all this stuff, because you kind of see two school of thoughts online primarily, where one person says, oh no, plate armor or mail armor would not be able to withstand an arrow. This is a defunct argument, and others would say complete opposite. I think it's one of those things where every piece of armor has a weak point, and whenever you're in combat with someone else, if it is a knight versus a knight, etc., both parties are going to know there's no point me trying to kind of hack away at this chainmail because I know how strong chainmail is. They're going to try and find a weak point instead. Which seems common sense whenever you kind of talk about it, but it's bizarre how little that kind of school of thought comes up.
Well, it goes back. I mean, I think I probably pursued this on the invincibility of the English longbow and the nationality or the nationalism that's behind some of the modern myth of the longbow. When I was young and we were playing I know this will stun all those who have grown up on computers, but we actually had miniature figures that were on a table.
This is unbelievable.
But the rules were written so that I remember I had a wonderful corps of French knights, and I rode in, and somebody says, "Oh, well, you're faced by English longbowmen, you're all dead." I said, "Yeah, that just didn't happen."
No,
sorry, that just didn't happen. And the fact is if you look at it, longbow archery is around for less than 200 years, effectively less than 200 years. Mail is around for 1,000 years.
Yeah,
it's not a situation where mail was expensive. Mm-hmm. It was hard to make. It was a lot more difficult to make than plate is later on, and yet it's worn by Romans all the way through, the early barbarians all the way through the knights, so forth. So it wasn't, people didn't just show up with their weapons and la-di-da against the guy who's paid for 70,000 rings of mail to be put on his body and said, well, I've got a sword, I can cut through that, or I've got an arrow, I can shoot through that. It didn't happen. And if you take the commonsensical out of the interpretation of arms and armor in the Middle Ages, if you make if you either make it so mythic that it doesn't make sense, or you make the person who's wearing it so stupid that he doesn't, that you're saying, well, that's why he's wearing it, because it was easily defeated, then you've gone down. You're wrong. At that point, you're wrong, because they were not stupid, and there was not nonsense. They were very, these were determined individuals who had their own protection. This is far different than a modern concept where you've got, you could stand miles away and lob an artillery piece on somebody, or stand across a field and sniper rifle 1,000 yards. These people are feeling the other's breath on them. And they're different than the samurai. The samurai has different weapons. The samurai have different code. They have a different reality of life and death. The Vikings are not picking on they're not picking on people who are particularly well armored, not in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So, there are differences there, but the defense was always better than the offense. And when the offense got good enough to defeat the defense, and that happens with certainly the move to plate, which can be attested to gunpowder weapons, can be attested to steel crossbow, it can be attested to better pole arms, staff weapons, can be attested to stronger swords, but it also can be attested to arrows. But then the armor got better; it changed, and the only time we don't see that is when the value of human life is less than the value of that armor. And that will happen in the early modern period where, essentially they can get soldiers, these armies can get as many soldiers as they want, they can mow them down, otherwise, and replace them with very little effort, very little expense. But in the Middle Ages, every single soldier, especially in the knightly armies, the soldiers were very, very valuable. And so they were protected extremely well.
I think one kind of final little nugget I want to discuss just on that topic, because I think we've covered a lot of probably what would be the other questions as well in this kind of one segment. I think what would it be safe to say and correct to assume that the likes of Mail Armour, incredibly defensive and good at defending against the likes of, say, piercing or slashing damage, or piercing or slashing attacks, unless, of course, it is the likes of a steel crossbow, which is firing or shooting with a strength of, I think you said 400 pounds.
Yeah, 500 pounds.
But one thing that obviously the Mail Armour isn't going to protect as well against is, say, blunt force trauma or blunt force damage, because obviously, because the mail is moving, if you get something big and hard enough and you hit somebody with Mail Armour on, it is obviously going to do damage to your ribs, your organs that are below that.
Yes.
Would that be safe to say?
Yes, and absolutely. Of course, there were protections against that as well, but usually that began to impede the movement of the soldiers. So you'd see it more on a tournament field, for example, where there's a directed blow is going to come from a joust. And then so the extra armor is put on to protect against that blow, because the purpose is to kill someone. But then it gets to such a point that they can't move their arms for tournaments. If you look at the early 15th or the late 15th and early 16th century tournament armors. But the rest is protection from being killed from a slashing or a piercing wound, very different from protection from a blunt force wound. Blunt force wound is killing by its simple, almost, think about barbaric kind of hammering on someone.
Yeah.
And the idea there is either to break the bones and then cause damage to the organs if you're going for the torso, or in the head, break the skull and do damage to the brain. And beyond the weapon, beyond the wounds that are coup de grace wounds, like the ones on Richard III's body, where he was after he had been knocked down, his helmet removed, pretty well went wild on him. But beyond those wounds, a blunt force trauma is the biggest number of wounds that we see that are fatal, and often to the head, because the skull. Although there's one dig a Gothic burial dating around the 6th century that showed a man had his skull bashed in, and he must have lived, even though it would have erupted it would have ruptured the membrane in the brain, because there's growth shown on the skull afterward. And so he must have lived for around 6 months after. 6 months is what has been estimated by the archaeologists. Wow. After the wound was delivered. Of course, he may have been the village idiot at that point, but
yeah.
So even blunt force trauma is not always fatal when it breaks when it does something like that. But yes, maces, hammers, anything that is, even swords and so forth, the bruising, other things like that. But that's the point where it's debilitating.
Yes.
If you can stun your opponent, get him down, then go for your dagger, go to attack an open area like Richard III's head is, and that is what is seen in most of these deaths that are in violent warfare deaths. So you're absolutely right, and the choice of weapons in this regard, again, you do not want to, if you are fighting to take knights for ransom, you're not going to be using those type of weapons. You're going to be using sharp edge weapons. You're going to be claiming prisoners and marching them over the side, taking them out of battle and those sort of things. But if you are trying to kill someone, yeah, absolutely, go for the ones that cause the most damage. And when you do see individuals who do not have the same value of human life, at least not among combatants, so they're not taking prisoners, such as the Vikings or the Ottoman Turks or the Mongols or some of these, then they're more prone to use those type of weapons because they don't care about taking prisoners or removing them, and those the easiest way to remove an individual from the battle. Perhaps the most colorful one, or cinematic one of these, is Robert Bruce of Bannockburn when the Earl of Hereford charges at him, and Robert Bruce has an axe in his hand and takes it straight down onto the skull of the Earl of Hereford and kills him. And that pretty well initiates the battle. But it's that's the type of thing, again, that you get down to the nonsensical and the stupid. It's nonsense to think that a knight on the war in a battle, when he is looking to kill opponents, is going to be using weapons that do not.
Yeah. So I mean, kind of, I think from what we've discussed already, you could most likely come to a conclusion for this next question, but just kind of very succinctly, how mobile would a knight be in one, mail armor, but equally, I'm guessing, I don't know if this is the correct term to use here, but I kind of see it as being partial plate armor, where it's not full plate. We're not at that stage, but there's kind of elements of plate armor dotted around the body. I mean, how mobile is that, and how, I guess, quickly would they be able to move on the battlefield? Again, as I say that, the common sense answer is, well, they're obviously going to be somewhat mobile, otherwise why would they wear it? But from someone who is qualified to give an answer on that, what would your answer be?
Well, and again, yes, the more sensible thing is, of course, they've got movement. But again, it's this weighing, the same thing with the helmet. At what point does comfort impede movement? Are you going for impeding movement for protection? Are you going for comfort or whatever? I had a funny experience when I started out doing this, maybe 20 plus years ago, and I was in the Wallace collection in London with Robert Douglas Smith, who was the chief curator of, or not curator, but conservator of the armor at the Royal Armories. And we're looking around, and asking him all these questions, and you see all the different articulated pieces for mail armor. I'm sorry, for plate armor there. And he turned to me and he says, "It's apparent to me you've never worn armor." Like I was the only one who never worn armor. And so about a week later, I was dressed in an armor that was patterned on one of the Henry V sets, or Henry VIII sets. So it was a bit later, and it was plate armor. Mm-hmm. But I realized at that point when they got me dressed, and it took 2 men to do it, precisely as Chaucer says, precisely as a Gowan Green Knight has him dressed, is that the movement was extraordinarily. Well, I won't say it wasn't. It was, great movement. It was obviously impeded somewhat by the armor, though, that I was dressed in. Mm-hmm. But I found, having played American football, that it was far better armor than I had ever used on the football field.
Wow.
It fit better. It moved better. So here we've got a sport that is limiting itself in armor to the point where there's injuries and some very bad injuries that are going on. But the armor smiths using metal in the Middle Ages were better at ensuring movement than they were now with plastic and Kevlar and other things. So it to me it was perhaps the best education I got, as far as, again, there's going to be a nonsensical, and once you pass the sensical into the nonsensical, once you put them into armor where they can't move, they're not going to move, and it's a gradation down. Now with mail, of course, everything bends. So the only impeding that you've got at all is the clothing you're wearing under, the clothing you're wearing over, and then the bunching of the rings when you bend your arm, or when you go, try to move, try to walk, or whatever, and that's going to be pretty minimal. So I think with mail, it was, and this is probably one of the reasons it lingered so long as a defensive, defensive armor, a defensive costume. I'm going to use the term. Then even into the era when you've got plate that can be put on, it's not until around 1450 we're going to see a complete full metal plate like we see in all the museums. So there's at least 150 years of transitional armor than what you're describing. Mm-hmm. But they had bits of plate before even, and they don't put it on. So I think that's probably the reason that it does take time, is as long as there's protection being given by the mail, and it does protect very, very well, then there's no need to move on to another, to investigate another type of armor.
There's this you'll most likely be completely aware of this yourself, but there is a great, I guess, assumption whenever we see samurai culture in pop culture, that they were these fantastic duelists who, whenever they were in open warfare, you would have had one samurai fighting one samurai, and it would have been this fantastical, I guess, dance of swordplay, which is in no way accurate or true whatsoever. With knights, is it much the same? Because I believe that there is some kind of assumption that knights were fantastic swordsmen and very adept at combat. However, there's equally I guess, an aspect of that whenever they're in open war or on an open battlefield with two armies fighting against each other, that kind of skilled duelist combat kind of goes out the window, and it's simply a kind of hack fest, for lack of a better word. Is that correct, or were they known for being skilled swordsmen, or was it just coming down to hacking at your enemy until they fell over?
Well, they were known for being trained and skilled. Uh, I mean, very, very recent work, the very good work, um, has shown the fighting manuals that we've become really prevalent in the 15th century and then in the early modern period could probably have either an origin or at least an oral origin before they get written down in the 15th century, which indicates that they're very detailed as to how to use a sword and how to use shields and how to use even a pole arm. So the idea that they were great duelists is absolutely right, and we get the names of individuals who are essentially professional tournament, professional jousters who go from town to town to town. Somebody like Ulrich von Liechtenstein, who never fights in a battle, as far as we know, but then it has an extremely long and very prosperous life as one of these very, theatrical jousters. He even did one joust in drag, and one tournament where he had everybody dress up as Arthur and the Knights, the Round Table. And that was in Italy, strangely, but and he was from the Alpine regions of Lower Germany, and so you do have those type of individuals, but I think it starts separating, and the ones that are good fighters, the ones that are good jousters, don't necessarily mix.
Yeah.
And the ones that are the ones that are good fighters, they know how to survive in battle, and they don't know what to do. When we get a description by someone who is credible, and remember, most of these are written by churchmen who weren't at the battle, or somebody who's apart from where the fighting is. They describe describe what is really just a mob of men attacking each other.
Yeah.
There probably is some sort of tactical notion when they go into it. So lines that are formed, in fact, we know there are lines that are formed. We know that there are maneuvers being made that have to be learned on a training field, and that they're good at it, both on horseback and on foot. But once the actual melee happens, it's, every man for themselves. And it's within these, you get very interesting stories about people going for the ransom of a very important individual, and they have to be the same rank. So you can't get a peasant who takes the Black Prince, for example.
I see.
The Black Prince was captured at Crazy, and held until, of course, the battle turns against the French. But it has to be somebody of the stature of the hierarchy to capture him. So here I am talking about this mob that is throwing, that are hacking away at everybody with their swords and so forth, and trying to stay alive with their own defensive maneuvers while they're getting pounded as well. The armor being perhaps the only thing that's protecting the two sides from just killing each other pretty easily. In the midst of that, there is this sense of chivalry that kind of comes into play. And that, we haven't really talked about that, but there is among the knights a chivalric code that determines certain things. Now, that code gets thrown out the window most often when you are in that situation, especially if your leader, like as Edward III does at Crecy, throws, says no prisoners are going to be taken. But there still is this thought that they are noble individuals and they have an honor that is associated with what they're doing. That does preserve that. Or I won't say preserve it, but you essentially will come to play in sometimes the oddest of times.
Well, to kind of go on to our final question, and this is the most theoretical and hypothetical question that could be asked. So, by no means is this a is by no means is this meant to be seen as a scientifically correct answer. But in your opinion, knowing what you know of the knights, their culture, their warfare, if it was in a kind of disaster situation, food, water, resources are in short supply, and these three cultures, the knights, the Vikings, and samurai, were forced to fight against one another. From what you know about the knights and what you may know about these other cultures, who do you feel would be most likely to come out on top?
Well, that's a very good question. I think the interesting, and of course you have to build a culture around all of them as well, in order to get them fed and clothed and other things taken care of, and removing the church, which is such an important part of the Middle Ages, is, and also puts a different spin on these. But I would suggest that if I was to rank them, the Vikings would be the least. They were used to being smaller groups. They didn't really get together much, unite much. So I think that they are more raiders than they would be in a larger scheme as warriors. The samurai and I maybe because I'm not entirely as secure in my knowledge of the samurai culture, that they tended also to be, remove themselves from society, hide back, and then come out when they were called. Knights were there. They fought all the time. They were very organized, though, and as I said at the very beginning of this, they would have had to have others, probably 9 times as many, if not more, others to create a culture for the knights to actually exist in, grow food, make metal, make arms and armor. These are all things the knights couldn't do, but they would have organized the society so that they could have gotten done. And so and there's no question that even though it goes against the nature of feudal society, and to use the F word, in the Middle Ages and knights and society to build towns, I don't think towns could have existed in medieval society had there not been a feudal system, because that also organized food and surplus of food to be given to people who are living in the town and can't grow it themselves as well. So I think that it may be the pride of a place in this regard, but the knights would have built a stronger, more productive society than either the samurai or the Vikings. Vikings existed only with slaves that performed those tasks. The slavery was not an issue in most of knightly society in the Middle Ages. The samurai, they had very strict rules, they had very strict codes, but they also had to fight for somebody. So they really are a society that doesn't have leaders among themselves, except they have captains, but they don't have overall leaders. Every king in the Middle Ages was a knight. Had largely been probably knighted at some point, even if he wasn't very good. Richard II was knighted, was not a very good warrior. Edward II was knighted. He was a terrible warrior. So everyone's a knight, and that goes down. And then if you're a noble, you're likely to be a knight. But there are individuals, especially when you get in conflicts like the 100 Years' War, like a Joan of Arc, like some of the companions she fought with, who are knighted on the battlefield because of their capabilities, both leadership and in fighting capabilities. And that you don't see in these other societies. So I think as a total culture versus just being on the battlefield and only looking at the battlefield, but a total culture as the one type you describe in this game, the knights are probably They would be they would get to be the largest, the quickest, and they would be the most productive, the quickest. Whether they could linger longer than somebody who secreted themselves from society like the samurai, I don't know. They don't. In history, they obviously don't. So that makes a big difference. Vikings would disappear very quickly. Yeah. The knights are around for several hundred years, but the samurai go all the way into the 19th century. So yeah. That may give us an example. And the knight and the samurai can adapt to gunpowder weapons far better than the knights do. So in some ways, that's if you're looking for a longer goal, the samurai are going to be better than the knights. If you're going to look for a stronger goal, it's going to be the knightly society.
Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. I just want to thank Kelly once again for taking the time to sit down and answer my questions. If you want to know more about Kelly and the work he does, do feel free to check out some of his books. In the meantime though folks, thank you so much for watching today's video, and until next time, have a great week, and I'll speak to you all soon.